Oh, glad to see so many people here. For Tom Tugendhat, a conversation with Tom this evening. We're going to take about half an hour, have a quick chat through some of the issues, and then I would love to have questions from the audience too. But if the stuff as we're going along and you want to put your hand up, then do it, and let's see how we go. I'm Kate McCann. I'm the political editor at Talk TV. And Tom, I don't really feel like needs an introduction, but let's give him one anyway. He's the new Security Minister, and before that, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and has a long history and a big interest in international affairs and defence, and now security. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say. Well, I married a French woman, so I must have a lot of interest in international affairs.
Well, on that note, let's get cracking.
It's not scandal. We've been married now for 9 and a bit years, so there you go.
Great. Well, that's the way to kick off. So, Tom, welcome here this evening, and I suppose I should just say congratulations on the new gig. I mean, how are you settling in?
Thanks. Yeah, well, I mean, it's one of those things, isn't it? That when you take over a new job, it's really important to get a bit of time to settle in, to make sure you know how things are going. And what's really important when you take over a job like the Security Minister is make sure you don't have the largest security event the UK has handled 24 hours after you've walked into the office. So that was a bit sobering, but it was a huge privilege as well. I mean, it was quite something to be part of a team running whatever it was, 160 or so state visits all in one go, which is what that funeral ended up being. But it was an enormous privilege to be working with some extraordinary individuals in our police, our intelligence services, our military and so on, our diplomatic corps, who pulled together, I mean, an event that I think, well, I hope you'll agree, but I think did Her Majesty proud and showed the respect that we all have for her, and kept everybody safe. It did include a couple of conversations with a couple of delegations of people who didn't want to get on the bus. It's like, well, that's up to you. They were like, great, well, I'll take the car. No, that's not up to you. You either get on the bus or you don't go.
But you made an exception for President
Biden. The President of the United States, obviously, has a particular relationship with his car.
Special relationship, right, okay. Clearly you're talking about the Queen's funeral, but things haven't necessarily got a lot easier for you since that event. I mean, the party is having a difficult moment. The economy is having a difficult moment. What's the mood like at the minute?
So I think a lot of people looking at the mini budget, which is what you're referring to, of course, a few days ago, will have seen what I saw, which is some really important policies for a growth agenda. A lot of people will have looked at that and they'll have seen a huge number of issues that have been, frankly, on the books for a while and been waiting to be introduced. And so I have to say, I'm very pleased that they have been. I think that is important.
Including the 45p rate?
Well, I think that I think that having competitive tax rates is something that the UK has been speaking about for a long time. It's not a secret to say that the US, that Norway, that high tax economies like the Scandinavians, many of them don't have tax rates at 45%. So come on, let's look at this honestly and see what there actually is, and see that there is a real opportunity for the UK to engage in a growth economy. Now, that's got to be important. I mean, that's got to be something that we want to achieve, and many people have spoken about it, and I'm very pleased we've done it.
And how do you feel about the conversation that's going on at the moment around not uprating benefits in line with inflation, about potentially cutting public expenditure? That's going to have an impact on a lot of people.
Well, what we've got to do is we've got to make sure that we are setting out an agenda for growth, because the whole point about an agenda for growth is not some sort of academic exercise. The whole point of it is to make sure that our kids are better off than we are. I mean, that is something that everybody has been looking at and looking at different ways of squaring that circle. And we've got to find ways of doing it, because the reality is, across the Western world, we've got people in France and Italy and the United States incredibly worried that their children will be worse off than they are. Now, that's a huge change in the way that the global economy has turned, and that's over 20, 30 years, and we need to turn that around. So there's a lot of work we've got to do.
But there will be families who are already struggling to afford bills, rent, daily outgoings. If you don't uprate benefits, their children will be worse off.
Well, we've got to find ways in which people can get off benefits as much as possible and get into much better paid jobs. And this is this is the challenge of productivity that governments around the world are really struggling with. We talk about growth as though it's some sort of arbitrary number. It's not an arbitrary number. It's about making sure that people have better paid, high quality jobs that they're able to go into. And we've got to be honest and say that that's going to require investment and effort.
Yeah.
And this government is setting out an agenda that begins that discussion.
Even when it's very uncomfortable.
Well, you've got to start a process.
Yeah. We can come back to the discussion
I'm
on
sure
the
you
economy.
will.
I'm sure a lot of people have heard a lot on the economy, but you maybe came here to hear more about security. So let's kick off with that. What is the greatest security threat that this country faces? What keeps you up at night at the minute?
Well, when I walked into the office, first day you get sort of two files, metaphorically, just by the way. But the first is, these are the people who are trying to kill us and we know about, and these are the issues that might kill us but we don't know about. And the reality is there's an awful lot of challenge out there, and it's not news to anybody to say that, sadly, terrorism hasn't gone away. That is still a real issue that this country has to deal with, that sadly many countries around the world have to deal with. It's not news to say that organised crime is a real issue in, every country in the world, sadly. But what has become more clear in recent years is the overlap between state threats and organised crime, the overlap between state threats and actually sometimes terrorism as well. And that change is, I think, where we need to be putting a huge amount of effort. And that's why, I've spoken in the past, and now I've got the portfolio for it. I'm speaking a lot about economic security, because economic security is not just, it's not just the ability to make sure that your country is prosperous for 20, 30, 40 years into the future, but it's also about that ability to make sure that you are fighting fraud, you are not funding terror groups through, online scams, which some of them use. You're not supporting North Korea's nuclear industry through, the fraudulent networks that they run. There's a whole series of areas where economic security is fundamentally important to our country. And then, of course, there's the second area of economic security, which I'm afraid is dominating a lot of my time. You'll see a bill coming out on it soon, which is about the way in which we've got to guard our intellectual property and our businesses for the future. Because it's not enough, sadly, anymore, to be able to manufacture at home. You need to be able to own the intellectual property, you need to be able to develop the ideas, and you need to be then able to exploit them and make the profit, employ people back here in the UK.
When you're talking about that overlap between terrorism and states, a lot of people will probably think of Russia, potentially China. What's the country that sticks out most for you, really?
Well, I'm not going to go around pointing fingers.
Got to try.
But you've got to try. And you're not wrong that there are some quite obvious examples. I mean,
But I suppose what I'm asking you are there less obvious examples that maybe we haven't seen coming?
There may well be, but I'm not going to go there with you. Look, there are, it's not a huge secret to say that if you read the newspaper, in fact, if you listen to if you watch your TV show, the reports that you're running talk about the kind of threats that we're facing. These things are relatively well covered. I'll leave it like that.
And what are we doing at the moment to counter that? I mean, how secure do you think we are on that front?
Well, there's a huge amount that the country's doing, and I have to say the government has invested enormously, quite rightly, enormously in our intelligence services and our police force to make sure that we're safe. It's one of the reasons that I'm very pleased to support this government is the pledge to increase defence spending to 3%, because that it's not just about aircraft carriers and tanks, it's also about satellite capability and intelligence networks and so on. So there's a huge amount there to do, and I'm very pleased that we're doing it, because I think it's really important. In fact, and I see our friend, the Turkish ambassador in the back, it's important to have friends and allies like Turkey, an important member of NATO, with whom we're working together. So it's, these are the areas that I think we are doing well on so far, but the problem is, as we advance, so do those who are trying to do us harm. And so we've got to keep investing and keep advancing, and that, I'm very pleased to say, is exactly what the plan is and exactly what I intend to deliver. Yeah,
well, on that, I mean, in light of the fresh annexation that we've seen in Ukraine from Russia...
Illegal annexation.
I mean, there have been some who suggest that NATO needs to be bolder, braver, go further, that now is the time to really step up. Do you share that?
Well, I think NATO's doing an awful lot, actually. I think.
Yeah, but the question is, should NATO now be doing more?
Well, let's look at what NATO's doing, because there's a perception that NATO isn't doing enough because NATO isn't the one organising the military operations and so on. Well, these military operations wouldn't be possible without NATO. You wouldn't be able to arm a country like Ukraine unless there was standardisation between weapon systems, unless there was an intelligence network that enabled us to share our intelligence, us, the French, the Germans, the Greeks and so on, our Turkish friends, to share intelligence to assist others. There wouldn't, if there weren't the infrastructure, if you like, the bureaucracy of war, if you'll forgive me, but if there wasn't that essential baseline, then you wouldn't be able to deliver the results that you're seeing on the ground. Now, none of that takes anything away from the extraordinary courage of the Ukrainian people, who are absolutely essential. But that, if you like, that support function that NATO offers is absolutely fundamental and really, really important. So I think NATO's, first of all, doing an awful lot. Whether you think that NATO should actually have troops on the ground, well, that's, first of all, it's up to individual member states, not up to NATO, because NATO isn't it's not an entity in that sense, not a state in that sense. So it's not up to NATO to order, I don't know, Russian or a US or US or German troops to take on Russia. It's up to member states to decide that. What I think is important is that the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian government get the support they need, and I think that NATO is doing that.
Well, they don't feel like they're getting the support they need. I mean, Dmitry Kuleba has said he doesn't believe that the EU is being ambitious enough in its support.
That's the EU.
It is the EU, but I think the general point stands that there is a sense that there is a demand for NATO particularly to be braver, but yes, also the EU to step up and do more.
I spoke to him at the time of Ukrainian independence. When was that? August, 24th of August, which was the 31st anniversary of their Independence Day. And he was extremely complimentary about the support that NATO's giving, and extremely complimentary about the support that the UK in particular, but some other member states are giving as well. And he was very clear about it. Now, if I were the foreign minister of Ukraine, would I be asking for more? Of course I would, absolutely. And quite rightly he is. It's absolutely right that he should be asking for more. That's, his country is not only being attacked, but actually being occupied by a neighbouring tyranny. I mean, it's the most appalling situation to be in. So of course he's asking for more. He's absolutely right to. But I think when you speak to him, he would recognise that NATO has done an awful lot, and I think you'd also hear his criticism is rather more targeted of individual member states than it is of a generic organisation.
Which ones in particular?
I'll leave him to. He can identify his own.
Well, I suppose if we take a step back, though, just on that kind of wider point, I mean, how do we go about dealing with the threat from President Putin, a state like Russia, which is playing so far now outside of the rules, the accepted behaviour? Really, the tools we have to deal with that are not huge. I mean, we don't have a lot that we can do about the illegal annexation or the threat of nuclear weapons, because we won't deploy our own. I mean, what do we do?
So I don't agree with you there. I think there's an awful lot that we
haven't been able to stop it.
Well, being able to stop it and not being able to do anything about it are two different things. It depends what you're willing to do at which points. Now, Ukraine is not a NATO member state, and therefore is not covered by NATO's protective Article 5 agreement. That said, you've seen similar language as has been used against Ukraine, used against NATO member states, and no aggression, no physical aggression towards them. And I think that should be seen for what it is, which is a recognition that actually the NATO protective umbrella really does work. And though I wouldn't like it tested, I think people should be under no illusion that the Article 5 commitment stands. Every Prime Minister of this country for the last 70, 80 years has made it completely clear, and I'm certain that this one means it too. So I think that you've got to recognise that Ukraine is not a NATO member state and is getting an awful lot of support because the Ukrainian people are quite literally on the front line of freedom. But it is a different circumstance. But that said, I think there's an awful lot that this government and that I'm intending to do in the post that I've been given, which is to support protection at home. I mean, we speak about security, and you're quite rightly talking about Ukraine, but the reality is there are threats here at home. You know, the Skripals were murdered in Salisbury.
Yeah.
Were tried to be murdered in Salisbury, and Dawn Sturgis, a British citizen, was murdered in Salisbury. Litvinenko was murdered in London.
Yeah.
You know, we have seen a pattern of Russian violence here in the United Kingdom, and it is completely unacceptable.
Yeah.
And so there's a, you know, as you'll know very well, this is something that I've been calling out for whatever it is now, five or so years. And we've got to make sure that our own economy, our own system, our own country is ready and able to deal with these threats. And that's why bringing forward the National Security Bill that's coming, it's partly already introduced and it's coming back to Parliament soon, and then the Economic Security Bill, Economic Crime Bill that's coming in a few weeks' time, are such important changes, because actually, you know, protecting ourselves is about making sure we don't allow enablers to exploit our system, but it's also about making sure that our economy is resilient and secure. And that's where, you know, things like reforms of Companies House, that's an important element in the Economic Crime Bill, is so important.
Do you think that governments, including Conservative governments, have made the mistake of being too lax or blind to the threat of essentially Russian money in London, Russian investment in London, which has allowed this to perpetuate itself over the years?
I have been hugely critical over many, many years of the spread of some elements of Russian finance in our economy.
Why weren't they wise to it?
I think many governments have been wise to it. I think what we've needed is changes in the law, and that's what I'm bringing in.
And in the kind of longer term, do you foresee a situation in which President Putin can be brought back into the fold? Could you, for example, see a situation where you went to Russia to have conversations with the Russian government?
I'd be astonished.
So you think that's it, it's done, it's never?
I mean, look, you never say never, but President Putin has set out an agenda and a path that doesn't suggest any negotiation. I mean, let's see what he decides to do, but he's got to first of all recognise the territorial integrity of Ukraine. He's got to stop his campaign of assassinations around Europe. I mean, I've just mentioned some in the UK, but actually I could point to his attempted assassination of some Montenegrin politicians, his attempted corruption of the French electoral process when Macron was running the first time. You know, let's not pretend it's just us. Putin's been doing this around the world.
Yeah.
And so he would have to demonstrate quite a reversal.
That's quite stark, though. I mean, are there any Russian politicians or anyone within that world that you're still in conversation with? Is this government, is there any channel open at all?
You'll have to ask the Foreign Office on that. But
for you, though, from your
perspective.
perspective?
I speak to some Russian dissidents who are active here, and I was very lucky to see Vladimir Kara-Murza in London just before he went back to Russia. It was, I have to say, I mean, if you want to see courage, that's extraordinary. This is Vladimir is he's Russian, obviously, but he's also a British citizen. He had the right to stay here. He's highlighted the corruption and murderous regime that's in Moscow today. He's pointed to those in the Kremlin who have sought to undermine the liberty of his fellow citizens, and he knew the risks. And I spoke to him quite specifically and said, "Are you sure it's a good idea to go back? You know, we know what's going to happen. It's not exactly a secret. You're going to be arrested, you'll be tortured, and you might well be murdered." And he said, "Well, I can't help my people if I don't go back." And that was an extraordinarily brave thing to do. And very sadly, he is now in prison. So we should remember his name with enormous pride. He's an extraordinary man.
I want to ask you, before I move on, and I'll see if anyone's got any more questions on Russia before I do that, about what's happened with the pipeline. Because I feel like that story's kind of gone under the radar a little bit, really, largely because of what's happened with the economy in this country. What exactly do we know about what happened to that gas pipeline, and who do we think is responsible for it?
Look, I'm not going to go into details, but there's quite clearly a leak of gas from a pipeline. It's the only severe leak of gas like that we've had. I'm sure there are many people claiming many things about it, but it is the only one that's happened.
Do you think it's credible that it was sabotage by Russia?
I think we're going to have to wait and see what the reports say, but I think you can see what my thoughts are.
Anyone got anything that they would like to ask on Russia before I move on? Yes, so if you could say what your name is and where you're from.
My name is Mohammed Amersi, and I'm a chair of Tom. Thank you very much. The question I have is this, that if we look at the war of tomorrow, which Russia may well fight, it may include a bunch of cyber warfare, biological warfare, drone warfare, and even space warfare. My worry about Article 5 is that it talks about armed conflict only. Is there any scope for looking at Article 5 and changing it so that it does not limit it to armed conflict only, because it's only been invoked once after 9/11, and secondly, Article 5 does not oblige member states to put boots on the ground. So would you recommend changing that?
So this is outside my area, so I've got to be careful, because this is really James Cleverly's area as Foreign Secretary. Look, the Article 5 was worded for a certain period. Jens Stoltenberg is already engaged in that conversation. And as to obligation on troops, it never has done, and quite deliberately it never has done. It's also voluntary, by the way. I mean, clearly countries don't have to accept Article 5. And as you rightly say, it was only done once. So I think this is a conversation that NATO is having as to what a non-physical attack might look like. And there's clearly quite a lot of work to do. I have to say that here in the United Kingdom and amongst allies, including countries like Estonia, we're doing an awful lot of work on this. And NATO itself has got a cyber resilience centre, a cyber defence centre, which it's doing extraordinarily important work in helping member states to prepare and to defend themselves, and it's also looking very closely at disinformation as well. So there's an awful lot that NATO is doing, and I think it's doing an important and very good job.
Yes, the gentleman at the back.
Ambassador Isas Berunas has been newly arrived Lithuanian ambassador, so I might also continue on Russia. Sir, you by enumerating what Russia is doing, you mentioned the most threats associated with what's doing outside UK, meddling election in France, and then sabotaging probably the infrastructure, like gas pipeline and so on. What if I would ask you, and if it's a diplomatically right question, where UK stands as far as the resilience to possible threats? If meddling elections, disinformation, how you would assess British preparedness to cope with this threat?
So that's one of the areas that we're working on, and I think we're, as ever, there's areas that you can improve, and there's areas of work that we need to do. But as you know very well, the intrusion that you see in Vilnius and that others see in Riga and Tallinn is really quite severe, and we're not quite in the same space, but it's certainly true that Russia is trying things in different ways in different parts of Europe and different parts of the world, and it's important that we're all working together, and that's why the cooperation through NATO is so important. That's why Lithuania's contribution is really important, and I have to say it's a relationship that has gone from strength to strength, as you know very well. Your predecessors have been very, very well received in the UK for many good reasons, but particularly because of the cooperation that we've had on this. And your Foreign Minister Landsbergis has been fantastic in helping to drive quite a lot of this discussion in a positive direction.
On those threats and on preparedness, do you think it's a priority for the government? I mean, there's such a huge amount of other stuff going on. Do you think that people understand how important it is to be resilient? Yes. Yes,
absolutely. Now, this government is absolutely clear. I mean, when I was appointed by the Prime Minister, one of the things that she brought up in the moment when I was appointed in number 10 was talking about this and talking about this preparedness.
The threat from other countries.
The threat from other countries. The need to see security as not just domestic, but much wider. Yeah. The need to coordinate across different elements of government departments, and indeed, as the ambassador put it, across different media.
Yes, Sam.
sorry we missed your portion last week. We heard from Ben Wallace this morning, who told us to put you on the spot. You can respond to that if you wish.
He did this job a few years
Yes,
before
he
me,
did,
so
yeah.
I'll just blame him. Don't worry.
Yes. This business coming back to the gas pipeline. I understand that there was more than one hole made in the pipeline, and I know you can't answer fully the question, but are we clear what happened, or are we just surmising?
Look, I'm really sorry because this is. I would love to say exactly what I know, but you'll forgive me. I'm going to leave it as what I've said, because I think it would be inappropriate for me to go
We've
further.
had a good try.
Sorry.
No.
Hi Tom, Aubriana Grassi from The Guardian. I just wondered what you made of the recent comments by the Chechen leader calling on Vladimir Putin to use these low-yield nuclear weapons as sort of punishment for the recent setback they faced.
So I think every European country has been very clear on the consequences of using nuclear weapons. At various points, the United States has been very clear. And I think I'm right in saying, you'll have to check it, that Le Drian, the French foreign minister, when threatened with nuclear weapons by Moscow, did point out that NATO is a nuclear club too. And I think that anybody who thinks that that would be a low consequence decision is wrong. It would be a very high consequence decision. And it would be, first and foremost, of course, an absolute tragedy for those who were immediately affected. But the political impact would be very, very difficult to predict from there on. I have to say, I think that the Chechen, taking political advice from a Chechen warlord, may not be the greatest guarantee of electoral success for Putin in the future.
Would you say that the use of even a low-yield nuclear weapon is a red line?
Look,
That would really change the game?
Look, it's not for me to determine British government policy on those things on the hoof, but it is perfectly clear that for almost every country in the world, nuclear weapons have been an extraordinary taboo, and quite rightly, an extraordinary taboo for decades now. And reversing that would be a tragedy for all of us.
Yes.
Hi Tom, from the Greenwich Conservatives. I was just wondering about the amendments that you've laid recently to the National Security Bill that put quite a lot of reporting restrictions in place for companies that are either foreign actors or work with foreign actors. I was wondering what the thinking behind those was and whether or not it represents the beginning of like a British FARA-style regime like they've got in the States.
That's right, so that's exactly what it is. So the whole point of it is to build off what the Australians and the Americans have already done. So the Americans call it CFIUS, and the Aussies call it FARA, and we're calling ours FIRS, the Foreign Interference Regulation Scheme. And that's exactly what it's about, because we quite rightly talk about security in many different ways. And we've spoken about physical security and security against violence. We've spoken about economic security and foreign influence. And this is really narrowing it down, because I'm afraid we've seen in Parliament a Labour MP accepting money from somebody who has been highlighted as a probable Chinese agent of some description. I think Christine Lee was identified as working for the United Front's Works Department. And so lobbying on behalf of a foreign state without declaring it, I think, is something that we shouldn't allow in our democracy, and it's something that the Australians and the Americans quite rightly prevent, and I think we should too.
And a quick follow-up to that. The amendments as they're laid at the moment are quite strong. Do you expect that they'll get watered down through committee stage and beyond?
I expect the amendments to pass.
Any more on Russia? Yes.
I'm so sorry, forgive me, I can't hear you.
My question is this. Recently, both India and China abstained in the UN resolution condemning Russia from its illegal annexation of the Ukraine. I wonder what the United Kingdom's perspective is on this. I mean, how are they analysing this? How do they make sense of India's posturing on this very critical issue?
forgive me, you'll have to ask the Foreign Secretary on that one. India is a very close ally and has been for many years, and so I'm sure that the Foreign Office will have a view, but I'm afraid I don't know what it is.
I want to move on to ask you for your thoughts on what's happening in Iran at the moment.
Yeah.
I think there's a really interesting situation unfolding there, and we're obviously seeing, some of the footage of protests and the like. What's your kind of take on what's happening there, and whether it has any implications for the UK in terms of security?
So we have a very, very long-standing relationship with Iran, and sadly it hasn't always been great over the last few hundred years. But what we're seeing in Iran today is examples of remarkable courage. After a young Iranian woman was brutally murdered for the crime, only a crime in the eyes of the tyrants in Tehran, of not quite covering her hair enough, which is pretty extraordinary. But after she was murdered for that, thousands of young people, many women, have come out into the streets in cities around Iran and have demonstrated extraordinary courage and a hope for the better future. Now that's really quite fantastic. I mean, I must say, I watch with nothing but admiration, and I think that we've got to be careful as to how we help, if you see what I mean, because what we should be doing is celebrating the courage of those who are doing it, not getting involved in Iranian domestic politics. And I think that we're, broadly speaking, striking the right balance at the moment, and seeing people like Nazanin cutting their hair, cutting her hair as an example of support, I think is very, very humbling. That's somebody who really does understand the pain that this dictatorship can impose.
Are we seeing protests that may well last for weeks or months longer, or are we seeing a fundamental shift, do you think, in that country?
I don't know, I'm afraid. I don't know.
And you say that you think that the UK government is kind of doing what it should at the moment. I mean, where do you see that going if this is a fundamental shift? I mean, how supportive do you think?
Look, it's really hard to be hypothetical on this. What I can tell you is we have a fantastic diplomatic team in Tehran at the moment. The ambassador, Simon Shercliffe, is unbelievably able, a very, very, very high, high quality representative of our country, and I'm extremely impressed by the observations and discussions that I've heard from the Foreign Office team. But where this goes and quite how it develops, it's very hard to predict. So I'm afraid I'm not going to try and guess as to it. No, I'm afraid not.
And I suppose when you, I can try. And I suppose when you kind of zoom out a little bit, there were some people who said that post-COVID, because of how awful everything was, that there was a sense that nations would try and come together and strengthen around the things, that the unifying groups that already exist. But there have been some questions about whether that's actually happening, or whether actually nations are splitting off and becoming much more individual. What's your sense of that?
The problem is, it depends is the only answer to that. Different countries are behaving in different ways. I think one of the striking things is that the three countries that we've spoken about today, China, Russia and Iran, are all dominated by aging dictators struggling to hold on to power against a changing environment. So, unsurprisingly, they're doing what aging dictators always do, which is increase the level of violence to try and keep control. Whether that'll be successful, I strongly doubt.
But we could, given what you've just articulated there, be on the point of a real shift, a real change, because those dictators can't last forever, in theory. I mean, they can replace themselves.
Let me try and work on that. I've got enough on my plate without trying to predict the future in dictatorships.
We've talked a little bit about China, or we've nodded to it. But for you at the moment, what are the fundamental security concerns, or what's kind of on your list when the folder for China is there in front of you? What's kind of in that folder?
Well, there's, for us here in the United Kingdom, I think there's a fundamental area that we've got to be aware of, which is that our open economy, which has been an enormous source of strength for many years, is being exploited in different ways. And we've got to be aware that foreign takeovers are no longer just the stuff of foreign investment, but are also attempts to control. And so we've got to look differently at how that is handled. Now, the government has already done important work on this with the investment security bill, which has resulted in the investment security unit in BEIS, which is doing really important work. And there's no doubt going to be areas we're going to have to look at in coming years as the nature of investment changes. But I think that's really where we need to be looking, because I think there's an awful lot that we need to be focused on to make sure that we're adapting to the changing environment and investment. And I'm afraid quite a lot of it is coming from China, and that's where we've got to be focused.
What is our kind of relationship like at the moment with China? How would you categorise that?
You're tempting me onto areas where the Foreign Office is actually they own the relationship. So you'll forgive me, I won't go there. But it's.
Well, I suppose I'm asking you in the context of Taiwan. I mean, we've seen the comments from President Biden. Again, you're going to tell me no.
Look, I mean, Taiwan's an important democracy and an important friend.
Yes.
Hi, Gabriel. There is the online security bill coming up, of course, and there is the WhatsApp boss will Cathcart, who said that they want lower security for any government, because one of the online bills is that there's the issue of
end-to-end, yeah.
So the thing is to prevent any bad content, there is this kind of breach that might be. But WhatsApp saying that they want lower security for any government. So what's your point of view on this?
Well, look, I mean, I think publishers have a responsibility for what they publish, and you know, the issue with electronic publishers is they claim not to have responsibility because they can't read it. Now, I get that; they're still publishing.
But because their point is, I don't know if it's true or not, that this would open up, possibilities for hostile governments to breach into our security. Do you agree with that? Or?
I think there's different ways in which you can look at it, but I do think it is important that we recognise the influence of some of these large firms on not only on our economy but also on our society. And you'll have seen the inquiry recently into Molly Russell, which was, I don't know if you read any of it or watched any of it, but it was extremely heartbreaking to read the reporting of it. And I think we need to recognise that we have responsibilities.
What kind of security precautions do you take? Do you use
Quite a lot.
WhatsApp? Well, do you use WhatsApp? Genuinely, do you use WhatsApp?
Yeah,
or do you use an encrypted service?
WhatsApp is public.
But do you use it? Do you use an encrypted messaging service that you trust more, or?
I mean, short of going to the state, they're all relatively. I wouldn't consider any of them encrypted.
So what do you do? Speak face to face to people if you do genuinely do that. So if you were worried, you take it so seriously that you would only have some conversations face to face. Yeah. And how about things that you put on Facebook and Instagram?
Well, I use Facebook and Instagram for professional purposes. I don't put private stuff on there. But
how worried should we be? This might be a silly question. Forgive me. Everybody knows more about this than I do. How worried should we be about deep fakes?
Well, as somebody who, the day I got appointed security minister, that evening, the BBC started running the second series of The Capture. In which I was somebody who'd set up a China group was then appointed the security minister. So I think the BBC is already trolling me anyway. So, look, I don't know. I mean, there's a whole series of people who are better placed to answer that than I am, and I'd suggest you invite people from there. But I think we've all got a responsibility to look not just at the information we get, but the source of it. As you know, you don't need me to tell you this. Curated news from legitimate sources is a fundamental guardian of democracy, and there is a reason. Forgive me, that we pay journalists and we pay editors and we hold them to account. And we may not like everything they say, but we know who's said it, we know who's published it, we know why they've done it, and that's important to any democratic state.
Yes, the lady just in the blue scarf.
In that regard, we know how powerful things like QAnon and what have you seem to be to national security now in the States. It seems to weave its way through everything. the momentum they've got to destabilise. So how worried are you, and what can be done about that sort of, if you like, international use of what has grown in the States?
So, disinformation is a real problem, and it's something that we've seen spreading in different ways and causing different incidents around the world. We saw it, I don't know if you remember, but there was a whole series of reports that came out claiming that, this was in Germany in 2015, around the time that there was the big movement of people into Europe. There was a whole series of claims that migrants were somehow responsible for sexual violence against German women. It was complete rubbish. It was totally untrue. And it was being spread by Russian-based internet trolls who were pumping out this information. So I do take very seriously the responsibility that we all have to guard against disinformation. I can tell you that the government takes that incredibly seriously and is constantly looking at what's going out. And by the way, some of the big tech companies have been particularly good on it recently in calling out and identifying and closing down sites that have been linked to it. So I do think it's something that we've got to take seriously. It's not something that anybody, I think, is complacent about. That doesn't mean that disinformation isn't going to spread in different ways, and odd ways it will. But I think we also have a responsibility ourselves. And this is where, as conservatives, we know that it's not, the state isn't something that's done to us. The state is who we are and how we act together. And in that vein, that we are the state itself, what we share, how we share it, to whom we share it, is important. It really does matter. And making sure we trust the source of the information is an essential part to preventing disinformation spreading and preventing conspiracy theories.
Thank you very much. I want to follow up on a point that Kate made on Iran, if I may. So Iran is now facing what they call the George Floyd moment, which the United States went through as well. And there is a feeling that not much has been done by the E3 in the US because of its potential linkage to a backward movement by Iran on the JCPOA. Is there any belief in your mind that there is a linkage to the JCPOA, and is this something that could still be signed, and therefore the West doesn't want to upset Iran?
Forgive me, that is definitely for the Foreign Office to answer. But I don't think there's any link between what's going on in Tehran streets today and anything to do with anything part of foreign policy.
While the lady raised, just the gentleman there here.
Good evening, James Glass from London, Morton Lisdale. How come it's taken the recent events, sort of geopolitical events we've been talking about all evening, to trigger this shift towards national security on sort of infrastructure and IP and all that sort of stuff? The flags have been there for a decade, if not more. I always got the impression that Treasury won over national security, and that the dash for cash was always more important. How's that balance working with the fiscal environment we're in?
So, I mean, this is a tricky one for me, because when I got elected to chair the Foreign Affairs Committee in 2017, this was literally the first thing that I put on the agenda, was economic security and the way in which we need to coordinate our intelligence agencies, our regulators here in the UK, our embassies, and our business outreach, to make sure that what we were doing was investing for the future, not lining somebody else's pockets. And so it's something that I've been focused on for the best part of whatever it is now, 5-6 years. So I agree with you, it is fundamentally important. But I think it's one of those things that you've got to celebrate what is done and not try to look backwards. The reality is this government has set forward already a very, very important series of changes in the National Security Bill that's coming forward, a very important series of changes in the Economic Crime Bill that's coming forward. And both of these together will make a fundamental difference, both to the foreign influence and that some people are seeking to use to undermine our abilities in the future, and to the investments that we're able to make in order to guarantee our own future. So I think both of them are extremely important. And then there's more work being done in different ways to make sure that the regulators, to make sure that the departments are working better together, and that is something I'm taking very seriously.
A gentleman at the back. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Precautions from the Polish Embassy. So my question, and I hope you won't answer that this is FCDO sort of question, but
Try me.
in your opinion, the current situation, should UK reconsider its position on cooperation with EU in terms of security and defence policy? Do you think that
You know that's the FCDO. You literally spent time talking to FCDO officials about that.
also in your former position, I would like to hear your opinion on that.
Well, I can't speak on my former position, I'm afraid. I can only speak on my current one. Look, I think the relationship that we've had with Poland has been extremely positive. I think if you look at the relationship that we built up in the last 6 to 8 months, it's phenomenal. And the relationship between the United Kingdom and many European countries, certainly over Ukraine, but actually in different ways that has emerged in the last few years, has been extraordinary. You know, our partnership with the Baltic states, for example, has been remarkable. And our contribution, not alone, but as part of many other countries, in bringing Sweden and Finland into NATO has been essential. Now we're just waiting for one last signature, isn't it, Ambassador? And then we're good to go. So you know, it's
institutional cooperation with the EU.
Look, that's a conversation that you're going to have to ask the Foreign Office about.
Yes, gentleman there. Oh, would you like to answer that point? Oh, you know. Yes, of course.
I am sure the question which I will ask Peter Coward. What is the number one security risk for the UK now?
I wish I could say that number one. The reality is that there are a range of risks. Some of them are short term, some of them are long term, and we've got to make sure that we invest seriously now. So you know, investing in our own economic security. You can't have sovereignty if you don't have economic security. I mean, it's as simple as that. And I'm afraid that means that you know the work that the Treasury is doing, the important work the Treasury is doing in ensuring our prosperity into the future, is absolutely fundamental to our security. But it's also true, I'm afraid, I wish it weren't, but it is, that we need to invest very heavily in the NCA and in MI5, in MI6 and GCHQ and make sure that we're ready for the threats that we face today. I mean, I wish we could save on that, but I'm afraid that would be very unwise.
Do you think those threats, we're talking about 3%, is a huge ambition. It won't happen for defence spending until the economy is growing 2.5% of GDP. I think that's 2.5% growth is when you'll get 3% of GDP. That's what the Prime Minister has said. Do you think at that point we should be having a conversation not just about buying new jets or whatever, but about actually investing in cyber, that should become much more of a priority?
But that is part of defence. I mean,
it's a huge part of defence, but it's not always the priority when we talk about spending. Do you think it should become that?
I don't agree, actually. If you talk to people like the Chief of the Air Staff today, who you know, and the head of Stratcom, Strategic Command, you know, you'll see that actually defence itself is very focused on cyber. Just the capability is so essential to modern defence forces. Secondly, if you speak to GCHQ or the National Cybersecurity Centre, they're very focused on it as well. And you know, this is an area of government policy that we really need to. You know, there's more work to be done in coordination and things like that. That's true, but the reality is that is something that we invest an awful lot in, and our various different agencies on that are really very good.
You're smiling at me when I said you'll get 3% when growth is 2.5%. Why were you smiling?
I regularly smile because I'm a happy person.
Was that because was that maybe because you thought 2.5% growth is an ambitious target and it might not happen for a while?
No, I think we will get to 2.5% growth.
When?
You'll have to ask the Treasury for the dates, but I'm sure we will.
Yes.
Thanks very much. It's a question around how the different departments and agencies work together, and there was some reporting that the National Security Council was going to change to the Foreign Policy and Security Council. I'd be really interested to hear your any insight you could share on the drivers, the motivations for that, and if we can expect anything.
So you won't be surprised to hear that. I'm not going to say what's discussed at it, but what I've been really impressed by is the fact that the Prime Minister wants it to be very focused on delivery. What are we actually going to do? This is not a discussion forum in the sort of we're just bouncing ideas around. It's a discussion forum in the sense of we're here to deliver ideas that actually make Britain safer in the long term. And so I think it's a very, very welcome tonal change, but a tonal change that has a substantive effect. And so I think that's really important. I also think that if you look at the way in which the UK has done a strategy over the last 30, 40 years. It has incrementally got better. I mean, David Cameron's introduction to the National Security Council was an important change. His creation of a National Security Advisor was an important difference. I think another area where the Prime Minister is right, though, is we've got to be careful that these responsibilities lie in the appropriate areas, and having a sort of supercharged cabinet office isn't necessarily the answer for every single area, when actually other departments are better able to structure and to support the national security work that's important. And the Prime Minister has set out a very clear agenda on that. I've been given responsibilities that include some other areas, and I think that's really important if we're going to deliver.
Yes.
Thanks, Kate. Hi Tom, Harvey Morgan, City of Durham. Something linked to information and something you've been very vocal on in years gone by is the hardware side of things, so telecoms infrastructure. And I share your opinion. How do we fare with that these days? Was it in one of those two files, or have we got our act together?
The reality is that well, you're talking about Huawei. Let's call it what it is. The decision on Huawei, I always thought was a mistake, and I'm very glad that we changed it a few years ago. There's always going to be a challenge when we are reliant on manufacturers in some countries that may not always be quite as friendly as they might. And that's why, it's one of the many reasons, but one of the reasons why Taiwan is so important. The manufacturing of chips in Taiwan is extremely important to global security and to our national security. And it's also important that we maintain our own sovereign capability here in the United Kingdom. And investing in our own chip manufacturing and being prepared for the future, I think, is also important. It's one of the reasons why I've described in the past as two of the worst strategic decisions the UK took was to allow the sale of ARM and to allow the sale of DeepMind. Now, both of those went to friendly states. DeepMind went to Google, a US company, and ARM went to Japan. So it's not just about hostile states, it's about sovereign capability. And I think that there is more that we need to look at. But I think making sure that we have the right investment climate, making sure we have the right tax policies, making sure we have the right educational policies to have a long-term future in these industries is not just about growth, although 2.5% growth is important. It's also about security. And I think economic security really does start with the investment climate and the education climate that you create.
Yeah.
Hi again. The UK sounds pretty keen on joining this new European Political Community Forum. I'm just wondering what you make of that and how you think it will sort of help enhance the UK's sort of security cooperation with other countries.
I've been somewhat busy looking at other areas, so I'm afraid I haven't looked at that yet, but I will come back to you when I have.
Okay.
Yes, gentleman in the middle.
Hi, my name is Asgari. I work for a company called Emergent, and you mentioned Salisbury earlier. That was a few years ago. Do you feel that the UK is now safer against chemical and biological threats? And I also know that you are in the process of reviewing the biological security strategy. I was wondering if there's anything in particular you want to highlight that you think is important to improve there.
So I think the UK has done an awful lot of work since those days. I mean, let's not belittle the surprise, the genuine surprise that anyone would use a chemical like Novichok in a civilian. I mean, it's so horrific that nobody expected it. I mean, literally nobody expected it. And it murdered one completely innocent woman. It could have murdered thousands. I mean, the extraordinary, rash, cavalier attitude with which Putin deployed such a toxic substance in the UK demonstrates a complete callous disregard for the lives of not just thousands of British people, but actually for his own agents, for people on the aircraft on the way over, for whoever it was who drove his agents to the aircraft. You know, thousands of people in the chain. It's absolutely horrific. So it's really pretty extraordinary that such chemicals were used, and it's certainly true that now that we're aware of its possibility, we've been much more careful since.
you just said there that, you know, it was a real surprise, it was a real shock that weapon was deployed in the way that it was. Putin had used similar strategies before. I mean, when we discovered, you know, the awful things that happened in Bucha that we're now still discovering happened in other areas, people said, oh goodness, I can't believe he's done this. But I mean, he'd shown propensity to do that before. We're having a conversation about nuclear weapons here in which we're talking about that in the abstract. You know, it would be awful, it would be a red line, it would be a real move. But there's a chance that this is not that far away. Do you think the government, do you think you are live to that, as sort of live to it as we should be? Not that this is something that could happen, but that it might happen.
I think that we have long had conversations preparing for the worst, but I think that we shouldn't belittle the magnitude of the decision that it would be to do that. So, you know, I think we should be putting things in context, not looking always at the most extreme.
So it doesn't worry you?
Many things worry me, and when I read the security files every day, even more things worry me. But I'm very, very reassured by the extraordinary professionalism of our intelligence services and our police and military and many others.
I've always wondered this. Does it genuinely keep you up at night when you see some of the things and you read some of the things that you do and you go home to your family? Does it frighten you?
No, but then I have been doing something similar to this for 20 years in different ways. So.
But maybe not as at the sharp end as being able to see all of the security details that you now have access to.
No, I saw more when I was CDS's MA.
So it doesn't frighten you?
I mean, it's sobering, right? I mean, it's certainly sobering. But, you know, this country has a phenomenal success record of keeping our people safe. And I wish I could, I won't, but I wish I could tell you the extraordinary successes that people whose names you will never know, whose jobs you didn't even know existed, have had in keeping us safe in ways that you didn't even know was possible.
What keeps you up more at night? The
My
security
children.
threat? That wasn't one of my options. The security threat or the recent polling that shows the Tories 33 points behind?
I think the important thing for any government is to do what it thinks is right. I think this government is doing what we think is right, and I think that is the right thing to do. It is now up to us to carry the message and make sure we explain what we think is right. Now,
even if it sees you turfed out of government, ultimately?
Well, I don't think it will, because I think that it will result in a positive result for the country, and that will see us being rewarded appropriately in the polls. So I don't think it will, but it is the responsibility of government to do what it thinks is right.
And is there any element of what's happening, sorry, I'll come to you in a second, is there any element of what's happening at the moment, the conversations that the government is engaged in about, you know, the tussle between cutting taxes for the most wealthy, cutting support potentially or not supporting those at the bottom end, that makes you feel uncomfortable?
Look, I think you've got to work in a government as a team, and I think it's absolutely essential that I bring what I can to the team and support those who are doing their best, and that's exactly what I'm going to be doing. Because I think that these are really difficult times. These are difficult times not just for the United Kingdom, but for the United States, for France, for Italy. You know, I can point to countries around the world who are struggling in different ways. I can point to interest rates in the United States at 4%. I can point to inflation in the Netherlands at over 11. You know, I can point to real challenges that governments are having to face. I can point to tax rates that are lower than us in socialist countries. I can,
or you could answer my question.
But I am answering your question, and the way I'm answering your question is to say there are real challenges, and it doesn't help anybody for me to pick holes or to act like a commentator. I'm not a commentator. What I'm here to do, my job now, is to try and get the best policies for this country, to deliver a conservative agenda that delivers growth, that supports people, that makes sure that people have a future for their kids that is better than it has been for them. And those are going to take some really difficult decisions. And you're right, anybody at all can make comments about different aspects of any bit. But that's not helpful. What is helpful and what the British people want, what the Conservative Party wants, what my colleagues want, is a team that actually delivers in the interests of other people. It's not about me, it's not about... You're not a member of the Conservative Party, but you know what I mean. But you know what I mean. It's not about any one of us as individuals. It's about how do we deliver the best result for the British people. And I think the best way to do that is to come up with policies that support investment, that support plans for the future that support opportunities for others and make sure we deliver them.
So hi, Nadine Batchelor, Yahoo News. So I've spoken to people who have skipped meals for 5 days because they can't afford to eat. The Save the Children have said that the government's budget is an economic experiment, and it's deeply cruel that tax cuts being given to the highest earners, and then the government won't confirm whether they'll raise benefits in line with inflation. Nearly 1 in 3 children in the UK live in poverty, and we are the most unequal large country in Europe. Do you think it's morally defensible to produce a budget like this and not provide reassurances to those people who will not be able to afford to eat this winter, are using food banks, may not, even with the help with the energy, won't be able to heat their homes? Do you think it's right that the government is giving these assurances to the top earners and leaving those at the bottom who are really, really struggling with this uncertainty about whether benefits are going to be rated? And even ministers talk about cutting the fat off public spending when it's this bad.
Well, I think it's important that the government sets out the agenda that it's going to be setting out in coming days. You know that. I mean, Kwasi has already made it clear that he's going to be bringing forward the other side, as it were, of the budget, how we spend it, and he's going to be making sure that it works for the whole country. And I think that's really important. It is absolutely clear that you cannot deliver a society that works for everyone unless you factor in everybody in our society, and that's really important to do. Now, there's a lot of work to do. That's not a surprise. But it's also true that what we've got at the moment is we've got huge challenges across Western Europe. You've got the same challenges. I mean, highlighted some others there, but you talk to people in France or Germany, you find very, very similar conversations being had with real stress and real difficulty in managing these very difficult questions. And what is important for us to do is to make sure that we are delivering growth. And the reason growth matters is not because it's an arbitrary number, but if you want to pay, and we do, if you want to pay for new schools and new hospitals, you need to grow the economy. If you want to actually have a benefit system which supports people in their moments of need and helps them get through the times of real difficulty and into employment, you need an economy that's growing. You really just need to have an economy that's actually generating that opportunity. If you don't do that, you can wish it away, but I'm afraid you're planning for failure. And so that's why this really...
That won't feed a hungry child tomorrow.
Well, that's why we've got to set out the agenda that's coming up now, and that's why as I say, Kwasi is going to be setting it out in coming weeks.
Okay, I have time to probably take 2 more, and there are 2 hands, so yes. Lady at the back first.
Yes, Tom, you mentioned earlier about foreign agents. I just read the China National Intelligence Law, which compels any citizen, organization, or their business to hand over intelligence that they obtain around the world. Now, how can you protect British citizens from their own information being handed by companies like Huawei or whatever to the Chinese government?
Well, one of the reasons I objected to Huawei is I simply don't believe that it's a private company, in the sense that you and I mean a private company. It's a company that is wholly dependent on the good graces of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, whether you say it's got shareholdings and therefore it's private, I'm afraid that's a distinction without a difference. So, I think you're right to highlight the issue that Chinese state law has imposed on Chinese citizens, and I'm afraid that has consequences. And some of those consequences are we really do need to think hard about how we work with Chinese companies here in the United Kingdom.
I mean, there are even reports in the press about Chinese supermarkets being, centers for the extraterritorial application of their laws. They try to extradite Chinese people back to China.
Yeah, we've certainly seen reports of that from other countries around the world. Sometimes Chinese citizens put under duress in China in order to force a family member to self-extradite, if you like, and sometimes in 1 or 2 cases we've seen reports, though I'd be cautious about how reliable they are, of extradition.
And yes, final question.
So in sort of the challenging fiscal environment we're in, how do you specifically make the case for security without sounding like you're fear-mongering, which is often an accusation when you talk about things that may or may not happen, and the same goes for resilience and contingency. How do you sort of sell that to an electorate that it's worth spending money on?
Sure. So I think talking about security as a cost is the wrong way of looking at it, frankly. I think security is an enabler of freedom. If you want to have ideas and innovation in companies, you need to be able to protect the intellectual property that underlines them. Because if you don't, all you're doing is producing goods that are going to evaporate to other states. So you need to have, just as you need to have locks on your door, you need to have intellectual property protections, you need to have cyber defences, and some of those can be done by us as citizens, right? Like in the same way as you lock your door of your home, well, I hope you do, you lock your door of your home, you consider that part of your own duty, but you don't hire your own police force. We share the responsibility of that, and you don't hire your own army or your own navy or air force. We share the responsibility of that. And I think we need to look at security similarly. You have responsibilities, right? I mean, coming back to what protection, do use two-factor authentication on your internet. Do be careful of these things. Make sure you're, using proper security measures when you log in and log out and so on. But that doesn't mean that the state, the British government, doesn't have responsibilities as well to help at some of the higher end. And I think there's an awful lot that we're doing that is not just a cost, but actually an enabler. I mean, it's one of the things that I think many big investors look at when they're looking at where to invest around the world, is whether or not their investment will be protected long term into the future. One of the ways that people think about that, of course, is the rule of law and the stability of the government and things like that. But another is the ability to guard the intellectual property that they hold. And that's where the work of the National Cybersecurity Centre, GCHQ, and indeed many others is so important, not just in protecting our nation, but protecting our economy.
Thank you, Tom Tugendhat, very much for sharing your thoughts this evening.